Is that your daughter, sir? Is she safe?
We heard shots, what can you tell us?
The rescue took barely 10 seconds to execute. 10 seconds that shattered the neon-lit quiet of the Gangnam district, silenced the sirens of the approaching cruisers, and turned a violent kidnapping into a moment that would rewrite the city's headlines forever. Jang Suk-jin felt the shift instantly. The rain-slicked asphalt beneath his worn boots felt like a battlefield again, the air heavy with the static of 1,000 cameras and the suffocating presence of the underworld. He had barely tightened his grip on the small, weeping girl before the world around him stopped moving. He stood there, rugged and weathered, his faded U.S. Army field jacket stained with the grime of the streets and his silver beard matted by the rain. He was ready to retreat, ready to fade back into the shadows of the damp alleys he called home. But the man at the center of the motorcade didn't look away, didn't bark an order to his elite guards, and didn't reach for the polished weapon at his hip. Kim Woo-jin sat there, or rather, stood, a sharp-suited monolith of iron and cold authority, his silhouette casting a long, dark shadow over the wet pavement. Woo-jin's presence was suffocating, shoulders squared like a fortress, eyes cold and piercing, scanning the veteran with a weight that suggested he owned every soul in the city. It was a terrifying, quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout because its mere gaze was a command of life or death. But as the Mafia boss looked at the dirty, trembling fingerless glove clutching his daughter's teddy bear, the iron mask began to crack. The city of Seoul didn't just sleep, it exhaled a cold, metallic breath that settled into the marrow of Jang Suk-jin's bones. He sat on a flattened cardboard throne in the mouth of an alleyway in Gangnam, a place where the neon lights of luxury boutiques cast long, mocking shadows over the discarded and the forgotten. In this world of glass and steel, Suk-jin was a ghost haunting the machinery of progress. His fingers, encased in frayed, fingerless wool, worked a rhythmic pattern against the cold, a phantom habit of checking a rifle's safety that had never quite left him. He wore his U.S. Army field jacket like a second skin, the sergeant insignia patches faded and salt-stained, yet still carrying the phantom weight of the authority he once held. To the rushing salaryman, he was a smudge on the landscape, a rugged relic of a war they preferred to read about in history books rather than see shivering near their subway entrances. But behind his weathered face and the silver thicket of his beard, Suk-jin's mind remained a sharp, tactical map. He didn't just see the street, he analyzed it. He noted the timing of the traffic lights, the staggered formation of the black luxury SUVs that frequently idled near the private clubs, and the precise moment the wind shifted to carry the scent of expensive cigars and diesel. His broken warrior eyes, piercing and blue, were always searching for threats, even when he had nothing left to defend but his own dignity. He remembered the feeling of being a man who commanded silence with a nod, a soldier who knew the value of a perimeter and the cost of a lapse in judgment. Now, his battlefield was a 3-block radius of concrete, and his unit consisted of the other shadows who huddled in the steam of the subway vents. The world had moved on, trading the soldier's honor for the businessman's ledger, leaving men like Suk-jin to survive on the scraps of a society they had bled to protect. As a light drizzle began to fall, turning the pavement into a dark mirror, Suk-jin pulled his military cap lower. He felt the familiar, crushing weight of exhaustion and trauma, a heavy fog that whispered he was invisible for a reason, that he was a tool whose edge had finally been blunted by time. He closed his eyes, leaning his broad, tired shoulders against the damp brick wall, unaware that the quiet of the night was about to be torn apart, and that the sergeant buried deep within him was about to be called back to the front lines for one final, desperate mission. The rhythmic drizzle turned into a sudden, blinding downpour, blurring the neon lights of Gangnam into a chaotic smear of color. From his cardboard sanctuary, Jang Suk-jin sensed the shift in the city's pulse before he heard it. The air, once heavy with the smell of wet pavement, was suddenly charged with the sharp scent of burnt rubber and ozone. A black sedan, moving with a predatory speed that ignored the slickness of the road, swerved onto the sidewalk just 50 yards from Sukjin's alley. The screech of tires was a violent, high-pitched scream that echoed against the glass towers. Two men in dark suits surged from the vehicle, their movements practiced and clinical, the unmistakable gait of professional hunters. Across the street, a small figure in a white dress emerged from a luxury department store, a small brown teddy bear clutched to her chest. Lee Na-yun was a splash of innocence in the dark, rain-streaked world. She was waiting for a car that would never arrive, her pale skin glowing under the streetlights. The transition from peace to terror happened in a heartbeat. The men reached her before she could even cry out. A gloved hand clamped over her mouth, stifling a small, terrified gasp. The teddy bear fell to the wet asphalt, a forgotten casualty of the raid. Sukjin's heart, which had beat with the slow, sluggish rhythm of the forgotten, suddenly hammered against his ribs with the force of a percussion grenade. His vision narrowed into a tactical tunnel, the world outside the immediate threat ceased to exist. "Let go," she finally managed to shriek, a high, thin sound that was nearly swallowed by the roar of a passing subway train. The kidnappers began to drag her toward the idling car. The city around them remained indifferent, the drivers in their warm, dry vehicles blinded by the rain and their own schedules. But Sukjin saw. He saw the way the lead kidnapper gripped her shoulder, the way his partner scanned the perimeter for witnesses, and the way the girl's eyes, wide and red with a sudden, bone-deep fear, searched the shadows for a savior. The trauma that had kept Sukjin paralyzed for years dissolved under a surge of ancient, ironclad instinct. He wasn't a homeless man anymore, he was a sergeant on a rescue mission. The broken warrior within him roared to life, demanding action over observation. As the sedan's doors began to close on the girl's white dress, Sukjin launched himself from the shadows, a silver-haired ghost of war moving with a lethal grace that defied his age and his hunger. The tires screamed once more as the car prepared to vanish, but the shadow from the alley had already closed the distance. The sedan's engine roared, a mechanical growl that signaled the finality of the abduction, but the predators had failed to account for the ghost in their periphery. Jang Sukjin didn't run like an old man, he moved with the low center of gravity sprint of a soldier breaching a trench. His boots, held together by duct tape and prayers, found purchase on the slick pavement as he closed the gap in a blur of olive-drab fabric. The kidnapper at the rear door never saw him coming. Sukjin's first strike was a clinical application of force, a palm heel to the man's jaw that snapped his head back with a sickening crack. As the assailant slumped, Sukjin reached into the narrowing gap of the closing door. His gloved hand, rough and scarred, caught the edge of the frame with the strength of a hydraulic press. "Get out," Sukjin rasped. It wasn't a request, it was a combat directive issued from a throat that had swallowed the dust of forgotten battlefields. The driver, panicked by the sudden intervention of a ragged specter, reached for a weapon in his waistband. Sukjin's situational awareness, a gift from years of sergeant-led patrols, saw the movement before the steel-cleared leather. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy, industrial-grade flashlight clipped to his belt, a relic of his night watchman days, and drove it into the driver's collarbone through the open window. The sound of shattering glass and the girl's muffled screams filled the cramped cabin. Sukjin hauled the rear door open, his broad shoulders blocking the rain as he reached for the child. Na-yun looked up, her face a mask of terror, seeing not a homeless man, but a towering wall of protective iron. "I have you, Sergeant's word," he whispered, the ancient promise grounding his trembling hands. He pulled her from the seat just as the driver recovered, the sedan lurching forward in a desperate attempt to flee the scene. Sukjin tucked the girl against his chest, shielding her fragile frame with his own weathered body as they rolled onto the wet asphalt. He didn't check for his own injuries, he only checked the perimeter. The car sped off into the neon haze, leaving behind a trail of broken glass and a silence that felt heavier than the rain. Suk-jin stood up slowly, his joints screaming, his sergeant insignia patches soaked in dark. He stood in the center of the street, a broken warrior holding a sobbing girl and a small brown teddy bear, while the first sirens began to wail in the distance. The man who had spent a decade trying to be invisible had just declared war on the most dangerous men in Seoul. The distant wail of sirens sharpened into a deafening chorus as the night exploded into a strobe-like kaleidoscope of red and blue. Heavy black SUVs skidded to a halt, forming a jagged metal perimeter that pushed back the gathering swarm of reporters and onlookers. In the center of this artificial sun sat Jang Suk-jin, his knees pressed into the cold, wet concrete, his body a living shield for the small girl trembling against his chest. A door opened, and the air seemed to drop several degrees. Kim Woo-jin stepped out, a tall, intimidating monolith in a tailored black overcoat that looked like woven midnight. He moved with a cold, commanding presence that parted the sea of elite bodyguards and frantic police officers. His slicked back hair remained perfect despite the rain, but his face, usually a mask of controlled, calculating authority, was etched with a visible, jarring shock. For a long, heavy minute, the city of Seoul seemed to hold its breath. The monolith of iron stood 5 feet from the broken warrior. It was a collision of two worlds that were never meant to touch, the pinnacle of underworld luxury and the depth of street-level desperation. Woo-jin's eyes, sharp and predatory, tracked every detail, the sergeant insignia patches on Suk-jin's frayed sleeves, the way the old man's fingerless gloves clutched Nayeon's teddy bear, and the fierce, protective tension in the veteran's broad shoulders. Suk-jin didn't look away. His piercing blue eyes, weathered by years of trauma and hardship, met the boss's gaze with a sharp situational awareness that no civilian could mimic. He didn't see a powerful man to be feared, he saw a father who had almost lost his heart. The veteran's posture remained alert, a trained soldier standing guard over the only thing that mattered, even as the flashing lights highlighted the emotional contrast between his rough exterior and his compassionate instincts. "She's safe," Suk-jin rasped, his voice a low vibration that carried through the hiss of the rain. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for a reward. He simply tightened his arm around the girl as she pressed closer to him, her white dress a bright, fragile stain against his dirty field jacket. Woo-jin remained motionless, his hands, which usually dictated the fate of millions, shaking almost imperceptibly at his sides. The cameras flashed, documenting the moment the most feared man in the city was brought to a standstill by a man the world had forgotten. The standoff wasn't one of weapons, but of souls. In the silence between them, the monster looked at the man, and for the first time in 20 years, Kim Woo-jin found himself unable to speak. The headline was already being written in the rain, the empire had been saved by a ghost. The silence that followed was more deafening than the sirens. Inside the fortified glass of Kim Woo-jin's private estate, the air was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the underlying metallic tang of hidden weapons. The Mafia boss sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, watching the man who had saved his world. Jang Suk-jin stood in the center of the room, a jagged tear in the luxury of the setting. He refused to sit, his muddy boots leaving drying imprints on the hand-woven silk rug, his spine as straight as a bayonet. Woo-jin reached into his breast pocket and produced a checkbook, the gold nib of his pen scratching against the paper with a sound like a sharpening blade. He didn't look up as he spoke, his voice a low, rhythmic hum of power. "You saved the only thing I value. In my world, every debt is settled with interest. Name your price. This check is blank. You can buy the building you sleep in front of. You can buy the street. You can buy a life where you never have to see a shadow again." He slid the slip of paper across the obsidian. It looked like a small, white flag of surrender in the face of the veteran's poverty. Suk-jin didn't even glance at it. His piercing blue eyes remained fixed on a point just above the boss's head, looking through the wealth and the marble as if they were nothing more than a thin layer of smoke. The fingerless gloves, stained with the rain of the rescue, remained steady at his sides. "I didn't pull her from that car for paper, Mr. Kim," Suk-jin rasped, the gravel in his voice cutting through the sterile room. "I did it because she was a child in the dark. And I know what it's like to be left in the dark." Wu Jin's hand froze over the pen. He looked up, his sharp facial structure tight with a confusion he hadn't felt in decades. He was used to men who bled for money, men who killed for it, and men who begged for it. He was not prepared for a man who looked at a fortune and saw a burden. "Then what do you want? Protection? A job?" Suk-jin finally lowered his gaze, locking onto the boss's eyes with the fierce determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I want you to look out your window. Not at the lights, but at the alleys. There are men and women out there who held the line for this country, and now they're invisible. My price isn't the money, Mr. Kim. My price is that you stop treating the world like a game of chess and start seeing the people you're stepping on." He turned on his heel, the sergeant insignia patches on his jacket catching the dim light. He left the blank check sitting on the desk, a worthless scrap of paper compared to the weight of the honor he carried out the door. Behind him, for the first time in his life, the monolith of iron felt the crushing weight of a debt that money couldn't touch. The heavy obsidian doors had barely latched behind the veteran when a small, soft presence filled the vacuum of the room. Lee Na-yun didn't knock, she drifted in like a ghost of the innocence Kim Woo-jin had long ago traded for power. Her white dress was clean now, the mud of the Seoul streets laundered away, but she still clutched the brown teddy bear as if it were a life preserver. Woo-jin sat motionless, his gaze still fixed on the door where Suk-jin had disappeared. He felt the weight of the blank check on his desk, a piece of paper that usually commanded the world, now reduced to a confession of his own inadequacy. "Papa," her voice was a fragile needle piercing the silence. Woo-jin turned, his sharp facial structure softening by a fraction of a millimeter. He reached out, his large, scarred hand, the same hand that signed death warrants and orchestrated coups, resting gently on her shoulder. "Why are you awake, Na-yun?" "It's late." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she climbed into the oversized leather chair beside him, her small legs dangling. She looked at the obsidian desk, then up at her father with eyes that were red-rimmed and too wise for a 7-year-old. "Where is the soldier man? The one with the blue eyes?" "He went back to his home," Woo-jin said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He knew the veteran's home was a damp alleyway and a sheet of cardboard. "He was brave," she whispered, stroking the matted fur of her bear. "When the bad men took me, I was so cold. But when he held me, he smelled like old tobacco and the rain, and he told me he was a sergeant. He said a sergeant never leaves anyone behind." She looked up, her gaze becoming a mirror that reflected the monster sitting across from her. "Are you a sergeant, Papa? Do you leave people behind?" The question hit Woo-jin with more force than any rival's bullet ever could. He looked at his daughter, the only light in his darkened empire, and saw the reflection of a man who had built a throne out of the very people the veteran had asked him to see. He saw the monument to numbness he had become. For years, he had told himself that his violence was a shield for her, a wall to keep the world away. But looking into Na-yun's eyes, he realized he hadn't been protecting her, he had been building a cage that required the suffering of thousands to maintain. He reached out and pulled her into his lap, his tailored overcoat absorbing her small frame. As she drifted off to sleep against his chest, the Mafia boss didn't see a ledger of debts or a map of territories. He saw the faces in the shadows of the gilded lily, the ghosts of men like Suk-jin, and the heavy cost of his own silence. The monster was still there, but for the first time, it was beginning to weep. The change in Kim Woo-jin was not a loud proclamation, but a terrifying, quiet retreat that the underworld felt like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. In the smoke-filled backrooms of Seoul's private clubs, the silence from the obsidian desk was interpreted not as peace, but as a fatal crack in the foundation. The lieutenants, men who lived by the blade and the ledger, began to gather in the shadows, their whispers sharp and hungry. To them, a mafia boss with a heart was nothing more than a liability, a monument of iron that had started to rust. Min-ho, Woo-jin's most ambitious enforcer, sat at a low table, swirling a glass of amber liquid that caught the dim light like a predator's eye. Around him, the vultures circled. He let a beggar walk out of his office with a blank check, Min-ho hissed, his voice a rhythmic hum of treason. He let a man who sleeps on cardboard dictate the terms of our honor. The boss isn't looking at the territory anymore, he's looking at the alleys. He's become soft, distracted by the ghost of a sergeant and the whims of a child. The treason was fueled by a dangerous realization: Na-yeon was no longer just the boss's daughter, she was his greatest strategic weakness. If the monolith of iron could be moved to tears by a veteran story, he could be broken by a well-timed strike. The vultures didn't see the redemption Woo-jin was seeking, they saw a bankruptcy of power. They began to coordinate, reaching out to rival syndicates and corrupt officials who had long simmered under Woo-jin's iron-fisted rule. Information began to leak: patrol routes, safe house locations, and the schedule of the girls' private tutors. The atmosphere in the city grew heavy and static, as if the very air were closing in to trap the Kim family. While Woo-jin sat in his high tower, struggling with the monster inside him, the wolves were already at the gate, sharpening their teeth on the secrets he had left unguarded. In the damp alleys blocks away, Jang Suk-jin felt the shift. His tactical mind, honed by years of surviving where others fell, caught the scent of the coming betrayal in the way the black SUVs moved, staggered, aggressive, and missing their usual discipline. He looked at his fingerless gloves and then toward the glowing skyscraper where the little girl slept. The broken warrior knew the peace wouldn't last. The vultures were circling, and the sergeant knew that soon, he would have to step back into the fire to protect a man who was finally learning how to be human. The betrayal didn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with the sudden, surgical silence of cut power lines. In the suburban safe house where Kim Woo-jin had taken Na-yeon to escape the city's heat, the world went dark at 2 a.m. Jang Suk-jin, who had been keeping a silent, unsanctioned vigil from a grove of trees near the perimeter, felt the change in the air, the sharp, ozone scent of a professional breach. Inside, the vultures had already bypassed the high-tech security, rendering Woo-jin's expensive electronic fortress useless. But they hadn't accounted for a man who knew how to turn a domestic kitchen into a kill zone. Suk-jin moved through the back entrance like a shadow returning to its body. He didn't have a tactical vest or a high-caliber rifle, he had his weathered field jacket, a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, and a handful of magnesium flares he'd salvaged from an old roadside kit. "Get in the pantry." "Now," Suk-jin rasped as he intercepted a stunned Woo-jin in the hallway. The Mafia boss, stripped of his guards and his control, looked at the veteran with a hollow, wide-eyed shock. Beside him, Na-yeon clutched her teddy bear, her white dress shimmering like a target in the moonlight. The first assassin rounded the corner, the red dot of a laser sight dancing across the wallpaper. Suk-jin didn't hesitate. He struck a flare, the magnesium eruption blinding the night vision goggles of the intruders with a searing, white-hot intensity. In the chaos of the light, the broken warrior became a whirlwind of improvised violence. He used the weight of the skillet to disarm the lead gunman with a bone-shattering strike, his movements a blurring echo of the sergeant he had once been. Woo-jin watched, paralyzed, as the man he had once offered a blank check fought with the ferocity of a wolf protecting its cub. Suk-jin wasn't using the elegant, choreographed violence of a movie, he was using the brutal, efficient geometry of a man who had survived trenches. He used a heavy silk curtain to tangle a second attacker, bringing the man down with a tactical sweep that prioritized speed over mercy. "Move!" Suk-jin commanded, grabbing the girl and thrusting her into Woo-jin's arms. The house was crawling with Minho's men, their footsteps heavy on the hardwood. The sophisticated monolith of iron was failing, but the sergeant was just getting started. As the front door was kicked in, Suk-jin stood in the center of the dark foyer, silhouetted by the dying glare of the flare. He was a ragged, silver-haired sentinel holding back the tide with nothing but scraps and an unbreakable code. For the first time, Kim Woo-jin realized that his empire was made of glass, and the only real fortress he had left was the man the world had forgotten. The safe house was a hollowed-out shell behind them, the crackle of localized fires competing with the distant, frantic rhythm of pursuing vehicles. Jang Suk-jin didn't wait for the cavalry. He knew the city's response would be too slow and likely compromised. He led the Mafia boss and the trembling girl into the dense, unlit woods bordering the property, moving with the eerie, silent confidence of a man who had navigated the dark for a lifetime. "Step where I step," Suk-jin whispered, his voice a low vibration that cut through Kim Woo-jin's mounting panic. The monolith of iron was stumbling, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the damp earth, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He was a king without a throne, stripped of his SUVs and his wall of black-suited enforcers. He held Na-yeon tightly, but it was the veteran's hand on his shoulder that kept him from collapsing into the brush. For Suk-jin, the trauma of the past wasn't a weight anymore, it was a compass. The long walk back was a tactical retreat he had practiced 1,000 times in his nightmares. He utilized the terrain with a sergeant's precision, leading them through a dry creek bed that masked their heat signature from the infrared drones circling above. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves was met with a sudden, frozen halt, Suk-jin's sharp situational awareness scanning the periphery for the vultures. "Why are you doing this?" Woo-jin managed to gasp as they reached the edge of a service road miles from the site of the siege. "I have nothing to give you now. My accounts are frozen. My men are gone." Suk-jin stopped, the moonlight catching the silver of his beard and the piercing, steady blue of his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small brown teddy bear, which had been tucked into his field jacket during the chaos. He handed it to Na-yeon, who clutched it with a sob of relief. "I'm not on your payroll, Mr. Kim," Suk-jin said, his posture straightening as the exhaustion of the night finally began to settle into his joints. "I'm on a mission. And a sergeant doesn't stop until the unit is home." He looked toward the horizon, where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the Seoul skyline. This was his final mission, not to win a war or kill an enemy, but to lead a man out of his own darkness. As a lone, uncompromised police cruiser appeared in the distance, signaled by Suk-jin's last magnesium flare, the veteran didn't disappear back into the shadows. He stood his ground, a broken warrior finally mended by the weight of a life saved, waiting to hand over the most precious thing in the world to a father who had finally learned what it was worth. The headlines that gripped Seoul the following morning were not written in blood, but in the startling ink of transformation. Across every digital screen and morning paper, the image was the same: Kim Woo-jin, the man who had once ruled the city through the suffocating weight of silence, standing on the steps of the National Assembly. But he wasn't there to answer a subpoena or declare a war. Beside him stood a rugged man in a faded U.S. Army field jacket, his silver beard catching the morning light and his piercing blue eyes fixed on a horizon only a soldier could see. The death of the Mafia king was a quiet, bureaucratic execution. In a move that sent shockwaves through the underworld, Woo-jin liquidated his criminal holdings, dismantling the monolith of iron piece by piece. The illicit warehouses were signed over to social programs, the front companies were audited and purged. The man who had been a statue of secrets publicly confessed to the existence of a world he had helped build, and then he walked away from it. In its place rose, the Guardian's Home, a national foundation dedicated to those the city had tried to make invisible. The headlines shouted of a Mafia reformation, but the true story was told in the quiet corners of the city. The veterans who had huddled over subway vents were suddenly met with a network of support funded by the very empire that had once stepped over them. Kim Woo-jin no longer wore the tailored midnight overcoat of a predator. As he stood in the lobby of the newly minted headquarters, he looked at Jang Suk-jin, who now served as the foundation's chief of security, a title that finally matched the honor he had never truly lost. They were two men who had both been ghosts in different ways, one through neglect and the other through numbness, now finally visible to the world and to themselves. The final transformation, however, was private. In a sun-drenched garden far from the neon glare of Gangnam, Lee Na-yeon played in a white dress that was no longer a target. She ran through the grass, her laughter a melodic hum that replaced the screaming tires of her nightmares. She still held her brown teddy bear, but she no longer clutched it in fear. She looked up to see her father and the soldier man talking in the shade, their shadows no longer long and dark, but short and clear under a midday sun. The monster was gone, the Guardian had been born, and for the first time in his life, Jang Suk-jin didn't feel the need to check the perimeter. He was finally, truly, home. The legacy of the night the tires screamed in Gangnam eventually faded from the tabloid headlines, replaced by the steady, quiet work of the lives it had rebuilt. The story of the homeless veteran and the mafia boss became a modern folklore in Seoul, a reminder that the city's heart didn't beat in its stock exchanges or its steel skyscrapers, but in the forgotten spaces between them. The final lesson of Jang Suk-jin's journey was not found in the tactical brilliance of a rescue, but in the simple, profound act of being seen. His story taught a hurried world that invisibility is never a trait of the poor or the broken, it is a choice made by those who are too afraid to look. By forcing a man of iron to look into the eyes of a man of shadows, Suk-jin proved that human dignity is an unassailable fortress, one that cannot be bought with blank checks or dismantled by violence. For Kim Woo-jin, the educational value of his transformation lay in the realization that true power is not the ability to instill fear, but the capacity to offer protection. He learned that an empire built on numbness is merely a high-priced cage, and that mercy is the only key capable of turning a monster back into a father. His journey from a monolith of iron to a guardian of the vulnerable served as a testament to the fact that it is never too late to trade a legacy of blood for a legacy of service. The story's end was marked by a simple gesture that occurred every morning at the entrance of the Guardian's home. As the sun climbed over the city, Suk-jin, dressed in a crisp uniform that finally honored his rank, would stand at the gate. And every morning, a young girl in a white dress would pass him on her way to school, pausing just long enough to offer a small, formal salute. The veteran would return the salute, his weathered face softening into a smile that reached his piercing blue eyes. It was a silent pact, a promise kept between a soldier and the girl he refused to leave behind. It was a reminder to every passerby that the most courageous thing a person can do is to remain soft in a world that demands you be made of stone. The mission was complete, the unit was home, and the warrior's honor had finally found a place where it would never be forgotten again.